In the gentle hush of dawn, the city of Capua stirred softly, like a great lion rolling in its sleep. The streets were still, their cobblestones cool to the touch of the bare feet that might soon trace them. Birds, not the riotous city pigeons, but the more courteous doves and sleepy sparrows, gave timid calls to one another from olive trees leaning over clay roofs. A faint breeze danced down the Via Triumphalis, teasing through grapevines coiled lazily on terraces and carrying with it the faintest scent of warm bread and distant jasmine. Capua, known throughout the Roman Republic for its gladiator schools and sun-drenched vineyards, wore the early hour like a cloak of peace. In a modest domus near the edge of the city, nestled beside a grove of fig trees, a young man named Gaius rose from his straw mattress. He did so not with haste, but with a slow, deliberate grace, as if the act of rising was its own quiet ceremony. The cloth of his tunic was coarse, smelling faintly of soap-root and sun, and he moved with the ease of one used to the routines of discipline. Gaius was not yet a famed warrior. He bore no scars to boast of, no trophies from the arena, but there was a calmness in his brow, a patience in his limbs, that hinted at a different kind of strength, the quiet determination of one who trains not for glory, but for the art itself. His training would begin at first light, as it always did, not with clashing swords or battle cries, but with the rhythm of breath and balance. He stepped outside, the cool earth grounding him, and stood still for a long moment. This was his favorite part of the day, the silence before the city stretched and yawned, before the clang of practice swords rang through the fields. The birds seemed to watch him as he began. First, he stretched his arms wide, then curled them, slowly inward, like waves receding into the sea. His movements were borrowed from the old Etruscan dances, taught by an elderly trainer who insisted that grace was the twin of power. Each movement, though simple, held a discipline of years. The way he pivoted on one foot, the curve of his spine, the way his fingers followed through the air, these were not random. Nearby, a tortoise ambled through the underbrush, unbothered by the presence of the human practicing in stillness. Even the creatures of the grove had come to expect Gaius and his morning rituals. He turned slowly in a circle, arms extended, feeling the weight of the morning air. His eyes were half closed, listening more than seeing. In this quiet state, the city became a rhythm behind him, a pulse that matched his breath. 1, 2, inhale, 3, 4, exhale. A warrior's training, he believed, began with stillness, not action. By the time the first rays of sunlight kissed the tops of the cypress trees, Gaius was already beaded with sweat, though not from exertion, but from the simple persistence of motion. He had yet to lift a weapon today. That would come later. For now, the discipline of form, of balance, of silence was enough. Inside the house, his mother moved gently through the morning. She did not disturb him, for she too understood that these moments were sacred. She would leave bread and olives on the stone table and warm water scented with rosemary. Her son, though still young, carried within him the gravity of something ancient, and she honored that with her quiet support. A breeze rustled through the fig leaves again, and Gaius ended his sequence with a bow to the earth. He knelt, pressing his palms against the ground, and whispered something in Latin, an old phrase taught to him by a Greek slave long since freed. To the dust I owe my stance, to the sky my gaze. And then he rose. The sun had fully breached the horizon now, and Capua was beginning to stretch its limbs. The vendors would soon call their wares. The clang of the forge would soon echo through the alleys. And in the ludus, the gladiator school, the sound of men shouting, wood clashing, and orders barked would fill the air. But for now, in this suspended moment between silence and sound, Gaius walked back inside, heart steady, breath even. The Day would come, but it would not come rushed. He poured himself a cup of the warm water his mother had left, drank slowly, and leaned against the stone wall. Tomorrow he would repeat these movements, and the next day, and the next. Not for a crowd, not for conquest, but for the quiet joy of mastery. The sun climbed higher over Capua, casting a gentle golden haze across the rooftops and slowly warming the dust that lay thick upon the training grounds of the Ludus. The school itself was an old structure, built of sandstone and shaded in parts by tattered awnings and the long reach of cypress trees. A low wall enclosed the compound, though it did little to muffle the sharp grunts and soft thuds of morning practice. Gaius arrived just as the gates were unlatched by a sleepy servant boy, whose tunic hung too loose from his bony frame. The boy gave a shy nod, which Gaius returned with a faint smile, then stepped into the familiar courtyard. The ground was soft and uneven, made of sand that had been raked smooth just before sunrise. It clung to the soles of his sandals, warmed by the first touch of light. Around the perimeter, wooden training posts, pili, stood like sentinels, each worn smooth by years of practice. Near them lay wooden swords and shields, some chipped at the edges, all seasoned by sweat and repetition. Gaius did not rush to pick up a weapon. His first task, as always, was to greet the sand. He knelt and pressed his fingertips into the earth, drawing slow circles, feeling the texture of the granules beneath his skin. The sand had a memory, he believed. It remembered every fall, every footstep, every moment of hesitation or clarity. To train upon it was not to conquer it, but to learn from its patience. "Rise, Gaius," came a voice as rough as gravel, but not unkind. It was Titus the lanista, the master trainer of the Ludus. Once a formidable gladiator, now bowed with years but unbroken in will. His presence was like an old oak tree, sturdy, scarred, and rooted in discipline. He wore a simple tunic belted with leather, and his eyes missed nothing. Gaius rose, brushing the sand from his knees. "Your form is sound," Titus observed. "Let us see if your feet remember it." They began with the orbis, a circular drill around the wooden post. Gaius moved with care, each step measured, his wooden sword an extension of his arm. He did not strike yet. This was not the time for aggression, but alignment. His shoulders square, his hips turning in silent unison with his weapon. His eyes focused not on the post, but on the space around it. "Center," Titus muttered, occasionally stepping forward to adjust Gaius's stance with the light tap of a cane. "You are not chasing the post. You are drawing it toward you." The morning wore on like silk, unraveling slowly. The air thickened, not with noise but with the density of effort. Others had arrived, young men from various corners of the Republic, Nubians, Thracians, Gauls. Each worked in a quiet rhythm, respectful of the hour, of the routine, of the sand beneath them. Occasionally, a sparring pair would circle off to one side, slow-motion duels with dulled blades and wooden bucklers. But Gaius remained with his post, sweating more now, the sun now tracing bright fingers down his back. His sword began to feel heavier, not from fatigue, but from focus. He struck now, but not to wound. Each blow was a brushstroke, a whisper, a breath. "You fight like a poet," Titus said once, not mockingly. "Just ensure your poems do not end in your blood." The drills moved on. Versus Pili, then scutum passus, shield movement, where Gaius practiced the timing of cover and counter. The wooden shield thudded rhythmically against his arm, a steady metronome to his breathing. And then came the march. Titus led a line of trainees in silent procession around the courtyard, each holding their weapon and shield with arms fully extended. It was not to test strength but stillness. A warrior must hold not only the weight of arms, but the stillness of intent. Gaius's shoulders trembled, But he did not lower his stance. A crow landed briefly on the edge of the ludus wall, eyeing the proceedings with mild curiosity. Its call was sharp, then vanished. Even the birds respected the rituals of the sand. When at last Titus raised his hand and called a halt, Gaius let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. The courtyard shimmered now with midday heat. Sweat traced lines down his jaw and neck, drying into salt. He sat, not collapsing, but with a soldier's poise, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees. Tomorrow, you will strike not just at the post but beyond it, Titus said, standing behind him. You will strike at the fear of what waits on the other side of silence. Gaius nodded slowly, not yet fully grasping the lesson, but trusting it would find its meaning in time. As the others left in small groups, chattering softly now that training was done, Gaius remained for a few moments longer. He looked down at the sand, traced a lazy spiral with his finger, and whispered his thanks. The sand had taught him again, and tomorrow it would teach anew. As the sun sloped gently toward its zenith, the ludus grew quieter, its edges wrapped in a hush of heat and exertion. Most trainees had retired for rest, their muscles slack with exhaustion, but Gaius remained, as he often did, in the shaded ring beneath the olive arbor, where the heavy practice swords were kept. These swords were not designed for battle. They were not even meant to resemble weapons. They were crude lengths of olive wood, thick and knotted, weighted to test the very core of a man's endurance. Each one was nearly double the weight of a real gladius, crafted not to cut but to condition. Titus watched from a short distance, his arms crossed, the shadow of his form long against the dusty wall. You ask too little of yourself, the old lanista murmured, his voice blending with the hum of cicadas. Pick up the heaviest. Let the wood remind you of your flesh. Gaius stepped forward and selected the largest of the wooden swords, Rudis gravis, its handle worn smooth by countless hands, its balance unforgiving. As he lifted it, the muscles in his forearm trembled slightly, and his shoulder pulled back instinctively. He did not swing it immediately. He held it upright before him, like a priest might hold a relic, and let its weight settle into his joints. The air was thick now, not just with heat, but with the slow hum of his own pulse. He closed his eyes briefly. Each practice would begin with statio, the stationing posture. Feet shoulder-width, knees soft, back aligned. He brought the sword across his chest, then slowly lowered it until it hovered inches above the ground. This was not strength. This was conversation, with gravity, with wood, with the edge of failure. Then came elevatio, the raise. He lifted the sword with both hands, elbows bent, drawing it up as if pulling weight from the earth itself. His breath came shallow at first, but he steadied it. 4 seconds up, hold 4 seconds down, repeat. This motion, so deceptively simple, drained him faster than a dozen sword strikes. The goal was not repetition. The goal was awareness of every muscle fiber, every breath, every shift in balance. To train with such weight was to train not the arms but the will. Titus approached, his footsteps silent on the sand. He did not interrupt, only watched as Gaius continued the lifts. At the 10th repetition, Gaius's grip faltered, the wooden blade dipping slightly. He gritted his teeth, but did not pause. Enough, Titus said softly, and Gaius exhaled a long, shaking breath as he lowered the sword, but it was not over. Now came the walking form, ambulatum. With the weighted sword resting across his shoulders, Gaius began to pace the perimeter of the courtyard. Each step deliberate, heel to toe, eyes focused not on the path but on the rhythm of his movement. The sword pressed down on his shoulders, like the memory of future burdens. With each lap his thoughts began to wander, first to the ache in his arms, then to the sweat stinging his eyes, then further still, to the echo of a time before training, before sand and sweat. Hey boy, running through fields outside Capua, chasing shadows of heroes. He did not remember how many laps he walked. Only that when Titus signaled the end, Gaius's legs felt distant, as if borrowed from another man. He sank slowly to the ground, not from collapse but surrender. The sword lay beside him now, mute and massive, a teacher as unrelenting as any philosopher. Titus sat down nearby, not close, but within the arc of shared silence. "You see," he said, plucking a leaf from a low branch, "the weight is not there to break you, it is there to reveal you." Gaius did not speak. He only nodded, feeling each word like a stone dropped into still water. Above them the sun began to dip westward, casting long shadows across the ludus. The air cooled slightly, and the birds returned to the trees, their songs tentative but cheerful. Gaius rose again before the sun fully dropped. He carried the wooden sword back to the rack, placing it with reverence beside its siblings. Each bore the marks of hundreds of hands, of silent struggles played out in sweat and silence. He ran his fingers along the wood one last time. He would return tomorrow, and the day after. For the wood had more to teach. As he left the training ring, he walked more slowly than usual, not from fatigue, but from reflection. The world seemed different after carrying weight. The trees seemed taller, the wind cooler, the sky somehow more forgiving. Even the mightiest oak must rest, and so must the body tempered in sand and sweat. After the trials of the ludus, Gaius walked slowly through the outer districts of Capua, his limbs heavy with exertion, toward a familiar refuge, the public bathhouse, nestled beside the temple of Fortuna. The Thermae stood proud and humming, its colonnades shaded by flowering vines, and its marble steps worn smooth by generations of feet. Here warriors, merchants, poets, and old men mingled in steamy peace, their togas folded neatly beside oil flasks and wooden sandals. Gaius entered the apoditerium, the changing room, where carved benches lined the walls and mosaics of dolphins danced across the floor. He undressed in silence, folding his tunic with care. Every gesture here was ritual, not for others but for oneself. The transition into the caldarium, the hot bath, was like entering another world. Steam curled upward from the water's surface, catching the light in golden swirls. The air was thick with rosemary, thyme, and a whisper of olive oil. Gaius stepped down the warm stone steps into the pool, the heat embracing him like an old friend. He submerged slowly, allowing the water to ease the tightness from his shoulders, to coax the fire from his thighs. Around him, others spoke in low tones, rumors of politics, whispers of local games, the musings of aging soldiers reliving battles now blurred by time and wine. But Gaius listened only to the water. It spoke in gurgles and ripples, in the quiet murmur of movement. He leaned back, eyes half closed, and let the buoyancy take his weight. For a moment, he was neither trainee nor warrior, but simply breath and heartbeat. After a time, he rose and moved to the tepidarium, the warm room where light filtered in through alabaster windows, bathing the chamber in a soft glow. Here, he lay on a heated stone bench, wrapped in silence. An attendant passed by and offered him a cup of spiced water, which he accepted with a nod. As he sipped, a familiar voice broke the quiet. "You train harder than most, yet you never speak of why." It was Maro, an older gladiator now semi-retired, whose presence in the bathhouse was as constant as the steam. He sat opposite Gaius, his body marked by old scars, his eyes surprisingly kind. Gaius smiled faintly. "Because words weigh more than swords, sometimes." Maro chuckled, the sound low and unhurried. "And yet we carry them both, do we not?" There was no challenge in his tone, only curiosity. Gaius considered his response, not out of fear, but out of respect for the quiet that surrounded them. "Do not train for applause," he said at last. "I train for clarity. The body can teach what the mind forgets." Maro nodded, folding his arms across his chest. "That is the mark of a philosopher in leather sandals." Gaius allowed himself a rare grin. From the tepidarium they moved to the frigidarium, the cold bath, where the shock of water cleared the mind like a bell rung in the fog. Gaius braced himself and stepped in, his breath catching as the chill wrapped around his chest. The cold stripped away the remaining fatigue. It left him clean, not just in body but in intent. As he surfaced from a full submersion, he exhaled deeply, steam rising from his skin like breath from the earth. He stayed there a moment longer, letting the clarity of cold settle in his bones. When he emerged, an attendant offered him a strigil, a curved metal tool, and helped him scrape the oil and dirt from his skin. The motion was gentle, almost meditative. It reminded Gaius of the way wind shapes stone, slow, deliberate, transformative. As he dressed once more in the apoditerium, he felt renewed, not invigorated in the way a conqueror feels, but calmed, like a field after rain. The bathhouse was a sanctuary, not from battle, but from the self that battle builds. Outside, the day had cooled into late afternoon. The streets of Capua glowed with amber light, and the shadows stretched long across the cobbles. Gaius walked slowly, not with the stiffness of exhaustion, but the reverence of someone who had listened closely to silence and been answered. He passed a baker whose warm loaves sent sweet comfort into the street. He passed children playing with clay figurines, reenacting stories they barely understood. He passed a musician, tuning a stringed cithara, the notes soft and questioning. The city had returned to him gently, like a dream recalled in waking. As he reached his home, the breeze carried the smell of rosemary again, and for a moment it was as if the bathhouse had followed him. He sat by the small fountain in the courtyard, watching the ripples reflect the dusk. In his journal, small, bound in leather, and known only to him, he wrote with a reed pen, "Today the water spoke. I listened, and I was not afraid." He closed the journal. Tomorrow the sand would await, but tonight he would sleep not as a student, not as a warrior, but simply as Gaius. Morning in Capua had a hush about it, a solemnity that was not somber but reverent, like a prayer whispered across the tiled rooftops. For Gaius, this morning was different. Instead of reporting to the main courtyard of the Ludus, he was summoned to a smaller, more secluded space behind the main barracks, a space rarely used except by those the Lanista trusted deeply. There, under the arched shadow of a crumbling wall overgrown with ivy, waited an old man known simply as Cyrus. Cyrus was neither Lanista nor gladiator, and yet he had taught many of the Republic's most balanced swordsmen. His voice was seldom heard in the main yard, and his lessons were reserved only for those considered worthy of something beyond mere combat, those the blade itself chose to teach. As Gaius approached, he bowed respectfully. Cyrus responded not with words, but with a gesture, 2 fingers lightly touching the hilt of a wooden practice sword lying between them on the sand. "Pick it up," the old man said quietly. "But do not hold it as a weapon. Hold it as you would hold a truth." Gaius obeyed, lifting the sword slowly, carefully. Its weight was familiar, yet today it seemed different, less tool, more symbol. Cyrus circled him slowly. "Tell me," he said, "what is the purpose of the sword?" Gaius hesitated. "To protect, to defeat an enemy." The old man shook his head. "That is what it does. I asked you what it is." Gaius lowered the sword slightly, thoughtful. Cyrus took a stick and drew a line in the sand. "The blade," he said, "is not steel, not truly. It is intent made visible. It is a mirror. What you show it, it returns. He motioned for Gaius to begin a simple sequence: strike, withdraw, parry, pause. Not quickly, slowly, as if each motion were the final word in a sacred text. Gaius moved, the sword sweeping through the air with restrained grace. Cyrus watched, nodding occasionally. "Do not rush," he said softly. "Each movement is a question. What do you want? What do you fear? What do you choose?" Gaius repeated the sequence, and this time he heard the questions. With each swing, he considered his purpose, not just in the moment, but beyond it. They practiced for what felt like hours, though no sun or bell marked the passage of time. There was only the rhythm: footstep, breath, blade, breath again. Occasionally, Cyrus would intervene. Less tension in the wrist, more listening in the elbow. The sword must feel you as you feel it. At one point, Gaius paused to wipe sweat from his brow. Cyrus handed him water from a clay jug and said, almost as an afterthought, "The blade is not for war." Gaius looked at him, confused. "It is for understanding," the old man continued. "Even in battle, the warrior who understands his enemy has already won, because he does not strike blindly." They returned to the form, this time facing each other. Cyrus's movements were small, deliberate, barely perceptible. Yet each block and counter revealed a depth of awareness that left Gaius breathless. Not from speed, but from precision, from harmony. "You are not here to overpower the sword," Cyrus whispered, "but to befriend it." At the end of the lesson, Cyrus drew a circle in the sand with the tip of his sword. "Stand inside it." Gaius obeyed. "This is your circle," the teacher said. "Everything you bring into it, thought, fear, desire, shapes how the sword moves. It is not the enemy that decides your fate. It is what you carry with you into the circle." Gaius stood there for a long time after Cyrus left, alone, silent, the sword still in hand but no longer heavy. It was an extension of something deeper now, not muscle, but meaning. He practiced once more, inside the circle. This time not as a student proving worth, but as a seeker of balance. Each movement was quieter, each breath slower. The sword no longer cut the air, it conversed with it. When he finally stepped out, the sky had begun to shift to afternoon, and the sounds of the city resumed their background hum. He returned to his quarters, where he sat cross-legged on the floor, the sword across his knees. He did not write in his journal this time. He only watched the flicker of candlelight on the blade's surface. In that soft flicker, he saw not battlefields but reflection, not glory, but peace. And slowly, as if carried by the very rhythm of thought, he whispered, "Let me move with meaning, not might." The morning sun had barely risen above the city walls when Gaius awoke, not to the clatter of wooden swords or the barked commands of Titus, but to the gentle hiss of bread on a hot stone. The scent met him first, rich, warm, edged with rosemary. He sat up slowly, the woven blanket slipping from his shoulders, and stretched with a quiet sigh. Today, for the first time in several weeks, he was not due at the ludus. "A day of rest," Titus had said. "Even steel must cool between tempers." In the courtyard, beneath the ancient olive tree that shaded their modest home, his mother knelt by a flat stone oven built into the earth. Her hands, though worn, moved with a grace as refined as any sword form. She rolled dough with an olive wood, Rod folding it with care, humming a lullaby that had cradled Gaius in his earliest memories. "Awake already?" she asked without turning, her voice as soft as bread dough itself. He nodded, stepping into the morning light, barefoot, the stone floor cool against his skin. "The bread made the decision for me." She smiled, eyes still on her work. "Then, the bread is wise." He sat beside her, not speaking, watching her shape the rounds with practiced fingers. The rhythm of her motions was hypnotic. Press, fold, turn, press again. There was something ancient in it, something that preceded war and empire, something sacred. They did not need many words. Their silences were comfortable, like old sandals. "Do you remember," she said after a while, "when you were small and tried to climb this tree?" He looked up at the olive tree, its gnarled trunk twisted skyward, branches heavy with young fruit. "I fell on my third step and cried like a senator denied his speech." He laughed, the sound light and boyish, surprising even himself. She passed him a finished round of bread, slightly charred on one side. He broke it open, releasing a puff of steam, and dipped it in a bowl of crushed olives and herbs she had prepared earlier. "This bread," he said after a moment, "tastes like childhood." She looked at him then, her expression a blend of pride and melancholy. "And you taste of distance." He paused, the bread midway to his mouth. "Have I grown so far away?" "Not in body," she said gently, "but training teaches silence, and silence teaches solitude. I only hope it also teaches return." He did not answer right away. Instead, he studied the tree, the same one that had shaded him as a boy, where he had played with sticks pretending to be a warrior of Troy, where his father had once lifted him to reach the lowest fruit. That memory stung gently, like the bite of vinegar. "I carry you with me," he said at last, "in every form, in every breath. The steadiness in my hands, the balance in my step. It all began here, under this tree, with your songs." She reached out and brushed a curl from his brow. "Then sing them back when you can. Let this tree hear the boy it once held." They finished the bread slowly, in the kind of silence that holds weight and warmth. Birds began to chatter from the nearby wall, announcing the sun's full arrival. Somewhere beyond the olive grove, a neighbor's goat bleated indignantly. Gaius stood and walked to the tree, placing his hand on the bark. It was rough, cool, and vibrated faintly with age. "Will it still be here," he asked, "when I return, a man?" She joined him, her shorter frame barely reaching the lowest branch. "If you return not as a man but as yourself, the tree will always know you." Later he helped her clean the stone oven, carry water from the cistern, and gather figs that had ripened in the upper reaches of the tree. The day passed not in haste, but in small shared tasks, each movement a thread woven into memory. At midday they rested again in the shade, sipping watered wine and speaking of simple things. The baker's new apprentice, the cat that had stolen fish from the market, the stars that would rise later that night. As the sun began to dip westward, casting long golden beams through the olive leaves, Gaius looked at his mother and said, "Thank you for this day, for every quiet thing." She squeezed his hand. "Go back to your training tomorrow, but don't forget the rhythm of this kitchen, the weight of a wooden spoon, the strength of a tree." "I won't," he whispered. That night, in his room, with the scent of baked bread still lingering in the air, Gaius wrote only one line in his journal. "Strength begins in stillness, and stillness begins beneath the olive tree." The morning mist clung to the training yard like the memory of a dream not quite remembered. Dew glistened on the sand, turning each grain into a sliver of morning light. Gaius stood in the northern ring of the Ludus, alone, but not unwatched. In C. The center of the yard lay a row of wooden shields, scooter, each unique, worn by time and bearing the dents and scrapes of countless drills. Their curved surfaces caught the rising sun like polished bark, and the leather handles, darkened by sweat, awaited familiar hands. Titus approached without sound, a shield slung under one arm. He dropped it in front of Gaius with a soft thud. "Today," the old trainer said, "we do not strike. We listen." Gaius looked down at the shield. It was heavier than the others, oak layered in rawhide, with a central boss of iron polished smooth. It looked as if it had once been part of something larger, something sacred. He lifted it with both hands and felt the weight shift into his forearm, shoulder, spine. The strap creaked softly. He turned it, studied the arc of its body, and slipped his arm through. Titus nodded. Good. Now strike it. Gaius blinked. With what? Not with what, Titus corrected. With whom? And then from behind the columns, 3 trainees emerged, each carrying a practice sword and a lighter shield. Their faces were calm, their steps unhurried. Titus pointed to the circle drawn in the sand. Inside, let them strike. You will not answer. You will receive. Gaius stepped into the circle, his shield raised, breath slow. The first blow came quickly. A light tap from the left, then another from behind. A third to the front. Not cruel, not harsh, just consistent. The sound of wood on wood echoed in, the air like a drumbeat from some distant shore. Thump, tap, thud. The shield shivered in his grasp. Each strike vibrated through his bones, his breath, his thoughts. Titus's voice drifted over the rhythm. The shield is not silence. It speaks. Listen to its language. Gaius shifted slightly, adjusting his balance. The blows continued, each one a note in a melody he was just beginning to hear. The echo of each strike was different. The top right edge gave a high-pitched knock. The center, a deep boom. The sides whispered more than they struck. It was a song of pressure, vibration, weight and memory. He began to understand. Each part of the shield had a voice. Each sound told him something. Where the enemy stood, how much strength they used, how desperate or confident they were. He was not fighting. He was reading. Eventually the strikes slowed. Titus raised his hand and the trainees stepped back. Gaius lowered the shield, his arms tingling, his breath quick but not shallow. Well done, Titus said, stepping forward. Now you understand that defense is not retreat. It is revelation. They sat in the shade, and Titus brought out a smaller shield, a child's toy carved of thin cedar, barely heavier than air. This, he said, placing it in Gaius's lap, was mine, when I was your age. Gaius turned it over in his hands. It was barely the size of a plate, but it bore an old emblem, 2 wolves circling a tree. I kept it, Titus said, because it reminded me that strength is not in size but in promise. A shield is a promise, that you will stand, that you will hold, that you will not break for another. They were quiet for a while, listening to the wind move through the reeds near the wall. You are not alone in the circle, Titus said finally. How you carry every man who's held that shield before you, their courage, their hesitation, their dust. Gaius looked at his own shield, now resting against the training post. He reached out and touched its boss, feeling the slight warmth from the morning sun. Later that day, he trained alone, repeating the rhythm of shield movement. Step, raise, brace, breathe. Each movement had meaning now. The shield did not cover him. It expressed him. Not as a wall, but as a witness. That night, in his journal, Gaius wrote, "The sword speaks of will, but the shield remembers. It remembers every promise I've made to stand." As the candle burned low and the crickets began their song, Gaius leaned the shield by the doorway of his room, not out of reach, but not in hand. It was part of the space now, like breath, like belief. The air beyond the city smelled of ash and thyme. Just past the northern wall of Capua, where the hills rolled gently into fields once green but now grey, lay a path seldom travelled. Gaius had heard of it from Maro, spoken in a low voice, like a secret shared only between those who understood its weight. They call it the Cinder Path, Maro had said, because it burned once. A vineyard struck by lightning, swallowed by flame, but the roots never left. And so on a day when the ludus was still and the world felt quiet, Gaius walked there, alone, unarmed and barefoot. The earth beneath him was soft with old ash. Not sharp, not cruel, just dry as though the fire had taken the water but left behind a memory. His feet sank lightly with each step, and the cool of the early morning balanced the whisper of heat still hidden in the ground. He had come not to train the body but to hear what the silence might offer. Each footstep left an imprint, shallow, dark, impermanent. Yet in watching them, Gaius noticed something. The way the weight shifted through his arches, how his toes spread and curled slightly with each movement, the way his spine adjusted to each uneven fold of land. Walking became an exercise in awareness. He did not count the steps. Instead, he breathed with them. Inhale, heel down, exhale, arch rolls. Inhale, ball of the foot, exhale, toes push. Again. The land was not barren. Here and there, sprigs of wild fennel pushed through the ash, stubborn and fragrant. A cricket chirped once, then fell silent as if shy. The sun rose slowly behind his left shoulder, casting long, narrow shadows before him. He passed a fallen fence, half charred, half overgrown with ivy. A shepherd's post lay cracked nearby, its hook still intact. In this place, untouched by commerce or conquest, Gaius began to feel small in a new way, not diminished but humbled. The earth had burned and still breathed. The path had scarred and still opened. Eventually he reached a wide, flat stretch where the fire had danced most fiercely. Here the ash was thick, and the ground gave slightly underfoot like flour spread over stone. He stopped, closed his eyes, listened, and heard nothing. Not wind, not bird, not even his breath, only the quiet echo of heartbeat in his ears, and the feel of warmth below him, rising not from flame but from memory. He sank to his knees and placed his hands flat against the earth. The ash was fine, like powdered bone, like the pages of a book no longer written. "Let me carry this," he whispered, not knowing exactly what this was. Grief, maybe, or resilience, or the simple, unspoken truth that all things pass, glory, youth, even fire. He stood again and began to walk, this time not with the pace of a student, but with the reverence of a pilgrim. Each step forward felt like a chapter closed and another gently opened. He imagined warriors before him walking similar paths, after battles, after loss, after victories that did not feel like triumphs. He imagined farmers returning to scorched fields, children to rebuilt homes, mothers to empty cradles. In ash, all feet are equal. At the edge of the path, where green began again, Gaius found a small stone, dark and smooth. He picked it up, turned it in his hand and placed it in the fold of his tunic. A reminder, he thought, not of fire but of what remains. When he returned to Capua, the city felt louder, not in noise but in texture. The cobbles seemed sharper, the voices more brittle, the colors less forgiving. But in his core something had softened, not broken, not emptied, just made still. That evening, as twilight settled over the rooftops, he sat beneath the olive tree again, letting the warmth of the stone seep into his palm. In his journal he wrote, "Today the ash taught me how to walk, not to escape, not to arrive, but to witness." And he slept that night with the stone beneath his pillow, dreaming not of battle but of dust returning gently to the earth. When the city of Capua drifted into sleep, its voices fading into murmurs and dreams, Gaius remained awake. There was no wind, no song of crickets. Even the fountain in his courtyard seemed to hold its breath. He wrapped himself in a woolen cloak and stepped outside, lantern unlit. The path he took was familiar, past the wall of fig trees over the dry aqueduct and up the small hill behind the Temple of Mercury. There, on a patch of flattened grass, lay the sky's mirror, wide, dark, and uninterrupted. He lay down without ceremony, the earth still warm from the day's sun. Above him, the stars unveiled themselves one by one, like cautious priests stepping into an empty temple. First came Vega, then Antares, then the thin line of the Milky Way stretching like a brushstroke of pale fire across the heavens. This was no place of training, no drill yard, no arena. And yet, it was the place where Gaius learned the most. His father used to bring him here. They would lie together in silence until the boy grew restless, and then the old man would begin to speak, not loudly, but with the hush of someone retelling sacred things. "That one," he would say, pointing, "upward, is Jupiter's eye. It sees what you do when no one else does." Gaius had once believed that if he stared hard enough, he could see the gods moving behind the constellations, adjusting destinies, lighting fates like oil lamps. Tonight, there were no voices, but his own thoughts. Yet they did not shout. They wandered gently like fireflies in the grass. He traced the line of Orion with his finger, drawing the hunter in the sky, then Cassiopeia, then the little bear. How many swords had mirrored these stars? How many warriors had slept beneath them, hearts still echoing with battle, eyes wide with wonder? In the darkness, Gaius found something he never found in daylight: permission. Permission to be uncertain, permission to not speak, permission to feel small. He folded his hands behind his head, sinking deeper into the grass, and listened, not for sound but for stillness. It spoke in the rhythm of his pulse, in the cool air on his cheek, in the far faint hoot of an owl. The stars did not answer questions. They asked better ones. What are you protecting, truly? When you raise your shield, do you also raise your heart? If no one saw your victory, would you still chase it? He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the sky had shifted slightly. Time was passing, though it did not feel like it. Here it flowed like water beneath ice. Slow, constant, ancient. He reached for his satchel and removed a small scroll, a gift from his father long ago, its edges cracked and softened by many readings. On it were hand-sketched constellations and simple annotations in faded ink. "Stars are not above you," the last line read. "They are within you. You are the dust of their fire." Gaius traced those words again with his fingertip, letting them settle in his chest like warm bread. He thought of the ludus, of Titus, of the shield and the sword, of the ash beneath his feet, and the bread in his mother's hands, of his younger self, looking up at these same stars, asking simpler questions. He smiled. Even warriors were made of stardust. Eventually, sleep tugged at the edge of his thoughts, and he rolled onto his side, using the satchel as a pillow. He would only rest for a short while, just enough to let the dreams pass like quiet ships under the bridge of night, and in that sleep he dreamed of a sword made of starlight, its blade humming softly with the voices of those who had come before. He did not wield it. He listened to it. When he awoke just before dawn, the sky was paler, the stars fading like old ink. He stood slowly, joints stiff but spirit clear. The world was quiet again, preparing to be born anew. Before returning home, he looked back one last time and whispered, "Thank you, teacher." Then, carefully, reverently, he walked back down the hill, carrying no weapon, no shield, but something far stronger, a quiet understanding. There are days when words are unnecessary, when the tongue rests and the body speaks in subtler languages, breath, rhythm, the hush between heartbeats. Gaius woke to such a morning. No one summoned him. No bells rang from the ludus. No commands echoed across the courtyard. It was, as Titus sometimes said, a day for listening without ears. He understood what it meant now. He dressed simply, his tunic loose, belt unfastened. He took no sword, no shield. He stepped quietly through the sleeping streets of Capua, past bakeries still dark, past dogs dozing in doorways, past the slow trickle of water through a cracked fountain. He made his way to a quiet grove beyond the eastern ridge, a place the trainees seldom visited. There were no posts, no tracks worn into the earth. Only wild grass, a few crooked pines, and a circle of stones arranged by someone long forgotten. He stepped inside that circle, then closed his eyes, and said nothing. The silence welcomed him, like an old friend, wrapping itself around his limbs, resting gently on his shoulders. It was not emptiness. It was fullness without weight. He began to move, not in practiced forms but in slow-flowing gestures that emerged without thought. A turn of the wrist, a sweep of the arm, a drop of the knee. Each movement was a wordless sentence in a language spoken only between breath and earth. There was no audience, no measure of success, no reason but presence. He moved slower still, listening not to the world, but to the subtle shift of his own balance, to the way his foot pressed into the soil, and how it rose again. His muscles whispered stories, of ash, of bread, of stars. His joints hummed with memory. His breath carried all of it. He did not name the silence. He did not question it. He let it move through him, unshaped. And slowly, it began to teach. In silence, the body reveals its hesitations, the way a shoulder tenses before a strike, the slight delay in a step, the tightness behind the breath. All things that noise would hide now surfaced. He paused and placed his palm on his chest. The beat was slow, strong. He smiled. Then he moved again. He imagined facing an invisible partner, an echo of himself, not to defeat, but to understand. They circled. They bowed. They exchanged gestures of soft grace. In one moment he stumbled slightly, not enough to fall, just a hitch in the rhythm. He did not chastise himself. He closed his eyes and repeated the motion again, softer this time. Less force, more flow, like water choosing its course through stone. Nearby a bird fluttered in a tree, its wings rustling the leaves. Gaius paused to listen, then mimicked its movement with his arms. A sweep, a pivot, a release, not imitation, celebration. The wind passed through the grove, stirring the grass in waves. He matched his breathing to it, in and out, like tide against. Sure, an hour passed or two, time did not count here, only breath. Eventually he slowed, then stilled. He stood in the center of the stone circle, hands at his sides, eyes closed once more. He whispered, not with his voice, but with his presence, "I am here, and I am listening." A memory rose from within, a childhood moment when he sat beside his mother during festival days, watching her spin wool in silence. She would glance at him sometimes and smile, not with lips, but with the corners of her eyes. He had learned then that love did not always need language, nor did strength. He knelt, placing his hands on the earth. The ground was warm now, alive with the memory of movement. He bowed low, pressing his forehead to the soil, not in submission but in gratitude, to the silence, to the self that emerged from it, to the space between the beats of training where the heart reveals what it truly carries. When he rose, he did not feel tired. He felt emptied, in the best way, like a cup that had poured all its contents and was now ready to be filled again. He walked back to Capua slowly. The streets had begun to stir. The marketplace opened. Children ran between carts. Bakers called out to early customers. But inside him the silence remained, not a void but a vessel. He returned to his room, sat by the window and wrote in his journal, "In noise I learn how to fight. In silence I learn why." Then he placed the journal aside and let the sun touch his face. And for a long time he did nothing, and in that nothing he grew. The forge was hidden behind a row of fig trees near the eastern edge of Capua, where the city gave way to sun-baked fields. Few passed this way by chance. The path was narrow, the stones uneven, and the air heavy with iron and smoke. Gaius came, not out of necessity but curiosity. He had never seen a sword-born. He had held many, trained with many, dreamed with many. But their origins were as mysterious to him as the stars. He wanted to understand, not the function but the beginning. The forge itself was humble, a clay hearth built into a stone wall, a bellows strapped with leather, and a wide wooden table strewn with tools of elegant brutality, tongs, hammers, chisels and molds worn from generations of use. Behind the flame stood the smith. His name was Livius, broad-shouldered, his skin darker than ash, his hands thick with callus and memory. He greeted Gaius with a nod but no words, then returned to his rhythm. Breathe. Hammer. Turn. Hammer. Cool. Wait. The sound was hypnotic, not harsh, not random. It rang with purpose, with patience. Sparks flew in arcs, bright and fleeting, disappearing, before they reached the edge of thought. The sword being shaped was still red-hot, its form vague but promising, like something dreaming of its final self. Gaius stood in silence, watching. The hammer strokes were not all the same. Some were soft, coaxing, others sharp, commanding, but never careless. Each mark mattered. Occasionally Livius would pause, lift the blade to eye level, squint through the steam, then return it to the anvil. Nearby, a bowl of water steamed gently, lined with herbs that Gaius could not name. The scent was sharp and clean, bay leaf perhaps or thyme. Livius used it not to flavor but to bless, a ritual of the old faiths. At last, the smith turned to Gaius. "You've seen how it strikes," he said, gesturing to the blade. "But do you know what it remembers?" Gaius shook his head. Livius stepped closer, holding up the glowing metal. "This is not just iron. It is earth and effort. It holds every moment of its making, the heat of the fire, the beat of the bellows, the silence between hammers." He plunged the blade into the cooling trough. Steam rose in a furious hiss, then faded into calm. "Why are you here?" Livius asked without looking at him. Gaius hesitated, then answered honestly, "To know what I carry." Livius nodded, satisfied. He picked up a piece of raw iron, dull, formless, cold. "This," he said, "is potential. But only fire makes it speak, and pain gives it shape." He handed Gaius a smaller bar of metal and a hammer. "Strike," he said, "but not to destroy, to reveal." Gaius stepped forward, uncertain. The hammer felt foreign in his grip, blunt, weighty, honest. He struck once, too hard. The iron jumped. Livius didn't scold, he only adjusted Gaius's elbow. Again. With breath. Gaius inhaled, lifted, exhaled, and brought the hammer down softer. The iron rang, a clear, clean note. Again. He found a rhythm, not unlike his sword. Drills, only slower. Less about speed, more about conversation. The iron replied each time, not with words, with tone. When Livius returned to his own work, Gaius continued. Slowly, carefully, learning not how to forge, but how to listen. Time passed unnoticed. When the sun began to dip, Livius handed Gaius a cloth and gestured to the half-formed sword now resting on the table. "Wipe it," he said. "Not to clean, to honor." Gaius obeyed. The blade was no longer glowing, but it radiated something deeper, like a held breath, like a story waiting for voice. Livius looked out toward the fields. "You will carry many swords," he said. "But remember this, not all are meant to kill. Some are meant to remind, of earth, of craft, of care." Gaius nodded slowly. He looked down at the blade he'd helped strike. It wasn't finished, not yet, but it felt familiar, as if it had always waited for his hand. That evening, as he walked home, his tunic smelled of iron and smoke. It did not bother him. He returned to the olive tree and sat with his journal, the lantern flickering gently beside him. He wrote, "Today I learned the sword is not born in battle. It is born in patience, in the silence between hammer strikes, in the hand that knows when not to strike." And he slept that night with the scent of clay and iron lingering, dreaming not of war but of firelight dancing on cooling steel. There is a silence that only comes after thunder. It was this silence that drew Gaius, long after night had fallen, to the gates of the Capuan arena. The streets were empty. The torches lining the colonnades had burned down to glowing embers. Even the taverns near the forum had gone quiet, their drunken songs replaced by the low whisper of broom against stone. No one saw him enter. The side gate, left ajar for the cleaning crews, allowed passage to the inner hallways. Gaius moved with careful steps, his sandals barely making a sound on the cool marble floor. He carried no weapon, only a lamp. The flame trembled with each breath of air. The corridor opened into the great stone ellipse of the arena, once thunderous, with crowds and now vast and still. Moonlight poured in from the open sky, casting silver shadows across the sand. The seats, once full of spectators, were now just dark hollows. Echoes of applause long faded into the mortar. Gaius stepped onto the sand. It felt different without noise. No chants, no blood, no fear, just sand and starlight. He moved to the center and knelt, placed his hand flat against the ground, warm despite the hour. "This place remembers," he whispered. He had never fought here, not yet, but he had trained with those who had, and listened to the quiet pain behind their victories. The arena was not a monster. It did not demand blood. It received what was brought to it: glory, rage, silence, surrender. It was not the enemy. It was a mirror. He stood slowly, then walked the circumference of the arena, tracing a wide circle in the sand with his steps. He imagined the echoes still held in these stones, the cry of a young man charging with too much pride, the last breath of a fallen friend, the gasp of the crowd when a sword finds its mark, and in between, stillness, so much stillness. He stopped beneath the emperor's box and looked up. The marble seat was empty, the banners absent, the torches cold. Gaius bowed, not to power, but to presence, not to the men who ruled, but to the space that allowed such moments to pass through it. He sat in the sand, cross-legged, and let the night press in. Above, the stars hung low, the same stars that had watched 1,000 battles, the same stars that would outlast every sword. He breathed deeply and began to speak, not aloud but within. "What is victory?" he asked. "What remains when the cheering stops? Am I still a warrior when no one sees?" The answers came not in words but in sensation, the press of the earth beneath him, the softness of the breeze brushing his cheek, the memory of a hammer on iron, a shield echoing, a mother's hand brushing flour from his hair. Yes, he was still, was present. That was enough. A soft sound stirred behind him. Footsteps. Not hurried, not hostile. He turned, and there stood Maro, arms folded, cloak wrapped tight. "I thought I might find you here," the older man said. Gaius stood, not surprised. Maro walked to him and looked around the arena. "She sleeps differently at night." "She?" Gaius asked. "The arena," Maro said. "It's a living thing. She remembers who respects her and who doesn't." They stood together in silence for a while. Then Maro said, "This place, people, think it's for death, but it's not. It's for reflection. It shows men who they are when nothing can be hidden." Gaius looked down at the sand. And what if we don't like what we see? Maro shrugged. Then we return, again and again, until the reflection is not perfect but honest. The old warrior placed a hand on Gaius's shoulder. Go home. Rest. You have years before this place calls your name. Gaius nodded. He looked around once more, at the empty seats, at the silent archways, at the stars, and whispered, "Thank you." Then he left the sand, walking quietly, the way one leaves a temple. That night, he did not write in his journal. He only placed a small pinch of arena sand into a cloth pouch and tied it closed, not as a souvenir but as a promise. The rain came before dawn, not the thunderous kind that split the sky, but a soft, endless drizzle, like the earth exhaling after too long holding its breath. It fell in thin veils over Capua, brushing rooftops, slipping down temple columns, pooling in the shallow gutters with a quiet patience. Training was cancelled. Titus had simply said, "The sand will not hold your feet today. Let it breathe." So Gaius sat beneath the eaves of the ludus, wrapped in his cloak, watching the rain bead along the edge of the roof, then fall in slow, heavy drops. He did not mind the stillness. It was rare, almost precious. The others had retreated, to their quarters, some sharpening blades needlessly, others dozing or grumbling into their cups. But Gaius remained outside, legs crossed, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the puddles growing inch by inch on the stone. He was not waiting for the rain to stop. He was learning from it. Every drop seemed to say something, soft syllables of patience, of surrender. Not weakness, but quiet strength. The kind that does not rush, that does not demand. He remembered Cyrus once saying, "A sword unsheathed too often becomes dull, but a mind sharpened by silence never rusts." There was no rhythm to the rain. Or perhaps there was, but it was too old to be caught. Too slow for hearts that had not yet learned to beat in centuries. A drop fell onto his hand. He did not brush it away. It stayed there, glistening, then rolled slowly along his wrist, disappearing into the fold of his sleeve. He inhaled deeply. The air was thick with clay and leaf. The scent of old stones warmed by breath, not sun. His mind wandered, not with haste, but in spirals. He thought of waiting, not just today but always, waiting before battle. Waiting after injury, waiting to be chosen, waiting to be forgiven, waiting for his body to catch up with his spirit. He realized warriors do more waiting than fighting. Even the lion waits before it leaps. And not all waiting was idle. Some was growth. Some was listening. Some was preparation so subtle it could only be seen in hindsight. He stood up, stepped into the rain. The coolness wrapped him like a second cloak. His hair dampened, his tunic darkened, his sandals squelched with each step. He walked slowly across the courtyard, to the edge where the practice posts stood, tall, silent, darkened by the rain. He did not train. He only stood before them, as if greeting old friends who had nothing to say today but everything to witness. He placed a hand on the nearest post. The wood was slick and cold. He closed his eyes and imagined how many strikes it had received, how many falls it had seen, how many warriors had waited beside it, just like him. He smiled, then turned away, not in defeat, but in trust. Back beneath the eaves, he found a bench and sat again. The rain fell harder now, but it did not chase him away. He let it fall, let it speak. Let it measure time not in seconds, but in surrender. The sun never truly showed itself that morning. The light remained soft, blue-gray, as if wrapped in wet linen. He opened his journal, wrote with slow strokes, the ink bleeding just slightly from the damp. "I did not train today." I waited, but it was not empty. It was full of listening, and the listening made me stronger. He closed the journal, then leaned his head against the wooden beam behind him and closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to dwell in the fullness of stillness. He did not wait for the rain to stop. He waited with it, and in that quiet partnership he learned the weight of waiting is not what you carry. It is what you allow to pass through you. The sun rose like a silent flame, slow and deliberate, cresting the edge of Capua with the promise of fire. It would be a hot day, the kind of heat that sits low and still, pressing against the skin like wet wool. The kind that steals water from the breath, that turns shadows into luxuries. But there would be no mercy in the ludus. Titus believed that strength was not forged only in effort, but in discomfort, in resistance, in salt and fire. Gaius arrived early. The training yard was already shimmering, the sand faintly glowing with held warmth. He loosened his tunic, tied back his hair, and began to stretch slowly, methodically. Ankles, hips, shoulders, wrists. The others arrived gradually, most with sluggish steps and sunken eyes. No one spoke. Not because of tension, but because of heat. Words like water were precious. Titus stood in the center of the yard, arms folded, the sun pouring down around him like judgment. "Today," he said, "we do not strike for speed. We strike for endurance." He pointed to the far wall where rows of practice shields and wooden swords waited in the sun. 200 passes, with form, with breath, with presence. Do not chase the end. Let the end arrive. Gaius selected, a sword already warm to the touch. He lifted it, exhaled once, and began. The first 50 passes were simple, familiar. He moved as he had 1,000 times, stance, step, pivot, strike, withdraw. But by the 75th, his tunic clung to him, like a second skin. His hands were slick. The wooden hilt shifted slightly with each motion. The sun pressed down like a weight, not from above, but within. By 100, his breath came shallow. His heart thudded behind his ribs, not with panic, but with persistence. His throat tasted of copper and salt. He paused only long enough to adjust his grip, then continued. Each motion became a mantra, each repetition a vow. I am here. I continue. I remember. Sweat dripped from his brow, traced his cheek, dropped onto the sand. Salt into fire. The heat no longer felt external. It was inside him, coiling through muscle and thought, testing his edges. Did not look at the others. He did not count aloud. He did not wish the sun away. He welcomed it, as a forge welcomes flame, as steel welcomes temper. When he reached 150, his knees trembled. He breathed in slow and deep, and imagined the air as something cool, something ancient. Mountain wind, river mist, the shade beneath an olive tree. He moved again. Strike, step, withdraw, breathe. By 175, he no longer heard the clang of others, only his own rhythm, only the quiet beat of effort, only the hush of his own shadow. When he finally reached 200, he did not collapse. He stood, still, like a statue of the god Mars, forged not in marble, but in patience. Titus approached, said nothing, only nodded once, slowly, and handed Gaius a cup of water. He drank not in gulps, but in sips, letting the coolness cleanse his throat, his spirit. Afterward he sat beneath the far wall, the shade thin but precious. His legs stretched before him, his arms resting on his knees. He looked down at his hands, red raw, shining with sweat, and beautiful, not for what they had done, but for what they had endured. He took out his journal, fingers still trembling, and wrote with effort. Today the sun did not burn me, it baptized me in salt, in fire, in choice. He closed the journal, and for a moment he felt weightless, not empty, but refined. The sun was falling, slow and silent, stretching long fingers of gold across the sand of the ludus. Evening practice was optional. Most had already returned to their quarters, satisfied with the sweat of morning and the ache of midday drills. But Gaius remained, as he often did, drawn not by ambition but by curiosity. The yard was quiet, the air cooler now, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and distant bread ovens. He took up a practice sword, one lighter than usual, and moved to the center of the yard. There was no trainer, no opponent, only his shadow. It stood long before him, sharp and defined in the angled light, a perfect mimicry of his every motion. He raised the sword. The shadow raised one too. He stepped left. It followed. He breathed. It breathed back. He had never truly studied his shadow. It had always been there, beneath him, behind him, unnoticed. But today it was his only companion. He began to move slowly, forms from the earliest days of training. Basic stances, basic strikes, the kind a beginner might scoff at. But in their simplicity, he found space. Space to notice. The way his shoulder dipped slightly before a lunge, the slight delay in his pivot, the unevenness of his wrist during a reverse stroke. The shadow showed it all, without judgment. Without comment, just truth, he continued. Each motion now not a declaration but an inquiry. Why do I tense here? Why do I hurry this strike? What am I hiding from myself? The sun sank further, and the shadow grew longer, more dramatic. Its movements now exaggerated across the yard. He could see the flaws more clearly. Each mistake magnified, each asymmetry bold. But he did not grow frustrated. He grew fascinated. The shadow was not his enemy. It was his teacher. In its silence it offered clarity. He repeated one sequence, step, sweep, return 12 times, adjusting each time until the shadow finally moved like water, smooth, balanced, aligned. He smiled, not from pride, but from recognition. There you are, he thought, not the warrior others see, but the one I'm still becoming. He sheathed the wooden blade and walked to the edge of the yard, where the shadow no longer reached. He sat on the low wall, elbows on knees, watching the sun disappear behind the red-tiled roofs of Capua. His heart was steady, his mind quiet. He reached into his tunic and removed the small journal. By now its pages had curled slightly, edges soft. From constant use, he wrote, "Today I trained with my shadow. It did not speak, but it showed me more than words ever could. In it I saw the pieces of myself I often rush past. It waited for me, and I met it, fully." He closed the journal. The air was cooler now, the sky a soft blue-gray, a single star winking into being. He remained there until the last sliver of sunlight disappeared, then stood, bowed once, not to an audience but to the empty yard, to the earth that had held his feet, and to the shadow now fading into the coming dark, and he whispered more to himself than anyone, "Thank you," then walked slowly back home, his steps soft, and his shadow, at last, walking not before or behind him, but within. Titus did not begin the lesson with words. He walked into the center of the training yard, holding a long wooden staff, and with slow, deliberate movements, he began to draw a circle in the sand. The arc was patient, precise. No stroke rushed, no grain displaced beyond its rhythm. Gaius stood at the edge, watching. Then, with a single firm gesture, Titus drew a line straight through the center of the circle, from the heart outward, cutting across its perfection. "There," the old trainer said, "is everything you need to understand." Gaius furrowed his brow. "A circle and a line?" "No," Titus replied. "Two ways to live." He turned toward his pupil, eyes calm as weathered stone. "You train by the line. Each day you reach forward, each swing stronger than the last, each step closer to victory." Gaius nodded. That much was true. Titus turned the staff in his hands. "But what do you leave behind, always pushing forward?" he asked. Without waiting for a response, he stepped into the circle and began to walk its edge. One step, then another, smooth and steady. There was no destination, no urgency, only return. Gaius watched, and slowly he began to see it, the rhythm of it, the gentle arc of each step, the tiny shifts in Titus's balance, the way each circuit was not quite the same, yet carried the same calm. "There is learning here," Titus said, still walking. "Not in conquest, but in return. Not in progress, but in presence." Gaius stepped into the circle. At first he moved clumsily, too fast, too direct. He wanted to arrive, to extract meaning, to finish. But the circle had no end, only a center and an edge. He began again, slower, one foot before the other. He noticed the press of his heel into the sand, the way his tunic brushed his calf, the faint rustle of wind through dry leaves above. He stopped thinking about improving. He started paying attention. Titus paused and drew another circle inside the first, smaller, more compact, nearer the center. "This," he said, pointing to the inner ring, "is your core. Every time you return, same lesson, same motion, same breath, you draw closer here, not farther but deeper." Gaius nodded. He understood. For the first time in training, he didn't crave progress. He craved depth. Together they walked in silence. Two men, two paths, both curving, both deliberate. One old, one young, each finding a rhythm in the round. When the sun dipped low and the shadows stretched long across the yard, Titus stopped. With a flick of the staff, he swept the circle away. "You know now," he said. "Know what?" Gaius asked. "That when you stop counting how many times you've circled, that's when you've truly begun to learn." Gaius bowed his head in quiet acknowledgement. Then, without a word, he bent down and drew a new circle in the sand, smaller, softer, and stepped into it alone. That evening the sky burned orange and violet over Capua as he walked home, the setting sun casting his shadow in a wide arc behind him. He sat beneath the olive tree outside his home, opened his journal, and wrote, "I trained today, but I did not move forward. I turned, and in turning I found the depth I had missed while always chasing distance. I will return. Again and again, the circle teaches." He closed the book not with finality, but with a beginning. Quiet, whole, round. There was a tree near the edge of the ludus, an old cork oak, twisted and stubborn, whose branches leaned out over the outer wall like a hand reaching for the sky. No one trained beneath it, not because it was forbidden, but because it was forgotten. The tree offered no shade at midday, and dropped its acorns too early. Its bark peeled in rough sheets like scrolls left too long in sun, but Gaius noticed it. One morning, long before drills began, he wandered there, drawn by the shape of it. It stood half-split by age, the trunk cleft open as if the earth itself had once whispered something into its core, and still it stood. Still it reached. He placed his palm against the bark, rough, dry, cracked. And yet, beneath the surface there was life. He could feel it. Not pulse, not warmth, but something slower, deeper. It reminded him of bone, not the sharpness of broken ribs, but the strength of what holds everything together. The part of the body you forget until it aches, the part that endures long after muscle tires. Titus approached, silent as always, and stood beside him without speaking. They watched the tree for a long moment. Then Titus said, "Most think strength lives in muscle. But muscle is fleeting, it feeds on youth." He placed a hand on the tree. This is older than any of us, but it still holds." Gaius nodded. "Bark is armor," Titus continued. "But what matters is beneath it, the rings, the grain, the quiet memory of every season." He looked at Gaius, eyes soft. Train your body, yes, but grow your bone, your bark, your patience. That day Gaius did not lift a sword. Instead he studied the tree. He sat beneath it, knees drawn up, back straight, spine aligned with the trunk behind him. And he breathed. Not like in battle, not like in form, but like the tree. Slow, rooted, timeless. Each inhale a drawing down into earth, each exhale a gentle rise into sky. He stayed there for hours. Birds came and went. The sun shifted. Dust curled around his sandals and settled again. He did not move, only listened to the rustle of leaves, to the creak of bark, to the stillness between. At one point a beetle crawled across his foot. He did not flinch. It paused, felt his skin, then continued its journey along the cracked roots. He realized something then. The tree was not still. It was moving, just very, very slowly. Its growth was not loud. It was inward, invisible, unceasing. That night, by candlelight, he opened his journal, wrote in careful strokes, "Today I did not lift my sword, but I felt something stronger. I sat beside the tree. I heard what endurance sounds like, and it sounds like silence." In the weeks that followed, Gaius returned to the tree often, sometimes after training, sometimes before dawn, sometimes in the heat of day, when the sun made everything loud, and each time the tree was the same, patient, unshaken. It did not care if he was tired or triumphant. It asked nothing, only offered presence. In time, Gaius began to feel something shift within him. His footing grew, firmer, not heavier, just truer. When he struck, it was not with urgency. When he blocked, it was not in fear. He no longer braced, he rooted. His breath came slower, his eyes steadier. One day, during sparring, Titus called a halt mid-sequence. Not in frustration, in wonder. "You move differently," he said. Gaius said nothing. He only glanced toward the tree at the edge of the yard. Titus followed his gaze and smiled. "Good," he whispered. "You're beginning to understand what cannot be taught." That evening, Gaius stood beneath the oak as twilight fell. He reached up and gently placed his palm against the bark once more. "I'm listening," he said, and the tree, of course, did not reply. But the breeze stirred its branches, the leaves rustled like soft laughter, and beneath the bark, the bone of the tree remained still, strong, sure, just like the warrior it had been quietly shaping all along. The sword leaned quietly against the wall untouched. Its usual place on the mourning belt was left vacant, and the leather straps hung like silent vines from the hook above Gaius's sleeping mat. He had awoken with a decision, not of laziness, but of clarity. Today the sword would stay home. There would be no strikes, no stances, no breath measured by the weight of motion, only life, as it quietly unfolded. The morning air was soft, drifting through the open window like silk. Outside, the fountain bubbled gently, its rhythm unhurried, unbothered. The sun slipped gently across the floorboards, and Gaius stepped into it barefoot, each footfall a quiet promise of presence. His mother was already in the courtyard tending to herbs. She did not ask why he had not gone to train. She only handed him a sprig of basil and said, "The bread could use your hands." He smiled, and they baked. Together in the small kitchen washed in morning light, they kneaded dough, pressing, folding, waiting. The silence between them was not empty. It was seasoned, warm. The rhythm of their work was slow but sure, and when the dough rose, they both leaned in as if witnessing something sacred. Gaius spread the oil with care, then crushed olives with the base of a clay cup. The scent filled the room, rich, green, bitter, and round. No scent of iron, no smell of sweat, only earth. Later they sat beneath the olive tree and ate warm slices with goat cheese and figs. He did not speak of the ludus. She did not ask. Instead, they listened to the breeze playing in the branches, watched ants carry crumbs across the stone, and let the day bloom without demand. After the meal, Gaius wandered to the marketplace, not for weapons but for thread. His tunic had torn along the hem and he wished to mend it himself. A simple thing, but not insignificant. The old vendor eyed him with a knowing look. "A sword rests?" "It does," Gaius replied, "and perhaps sharpens differently today." The vendor chuckled, handed him a bundle of thread dyed in indigo, and waved him off without taking coin. "You'll return stronger," he said, "but maybe not where you expect." Gaius nodded, tucked the thread into his belt, and continued down the narrow alleyways of Capua. The city sounded different without the echo of blades in his ears. He heard laughter more clearly, the thud of fresh figs dropping into market baskets, a child humming an off-tune lullaby to her doll. The world did not slow without the sword. It softened. He passed a weaver's shop and stopped to watch the loom at work. The weaver, a woman with eyes clouded by age, moved with astonishing precision. Fingers flicking, threads crossing, breath flowing in harmony with the shuttle. She looked up once and said, "Even a net must rest between catches." Gaius bowed. Home again. He sat in the sun and stitched the hem of his tunic. The needle felt awkward in his hand at first, but with time, it too found its rhythm. Stitch by stitch, he mended more than cloth. He remembered Titus once saying, "A warrior who cannot cook or sew will one day die, not from battle, but from blindness." Gaius had thought it a joke. Now it felt like scripture. As dusk approached, he returned to the olive tree. He lay on his back, arms folded behind his head, eyes watching the slow emergence of stars. He did not write in his journal immediately. He waited. He listened to the air shifting in the leaves, to the last coo of doves finding roost, to the distant clang of a pot lid in a neighbor's courtyard. Then finally he opened the leather-bound book and wrote, "Today I let the sword rest. But I did not stop. I baked, I sewed, I listened. And I found that strength, like bread, also rises in stillness." He closed the journal and leaned his head against the tree. The sword stood silent against the wall, but in his heart something had sharpened, not the edge of a blade, but the shape of a man. The road was quiet. It stretched beyond Capua in a pale ribbon of dust and loose stones, meandering through low hills and open olive groves, past shepherd paths and crumbling milestones worn smooth by generations of passing feet. Gaius had walked this way only once before, years ago, as a boy clutching his father's hand. Now he walked alone. There was no training today, no assigned task, only a need, not urgent, not heavy, but persistent, a need to walk, to see the shape of distance, to listen to the space between footsteps. He left at first light, carrying only a small pouch of figs, a flask of water, and his journal. His sword, once always at his side, stayed behind. This was not a journey of defense, this was a journey of presence. The dust clung to his sandals, soft and warm. Each step kicked up a small cloud that drifted lazily, then settled again, as if reluctant to let him go. The rhythm came quickly. Left, right, inhale, exhale, a kind of moving stillness. He passed a farmer driving a mule, who raised a hand in greeting but said nothing. He passed rows of wild lavender growing untamed beside the road, their purple heads nodding with the breeze. He passed an old wall, more vine than stone, and touched it briefly, feeling the texture of age and surrender beneath his fingertips. By mid-morning the sun had warmed the world to gold. Birds moved in short, sharp arcs overhead. The road curved gently, as if tracing the landscape's memory. Gaius paused atop a low rise and looked back. Capua was a small smudge on the horizon now. Its sounds faded, its weight lifted. Here there was only dust and distance and breath. He continued. The road, it seemed, did not care who walked it. It offered no praise, no judgment, it simply received. Step after step, with the same patience it had shown to countless feet before his, he remembered a phrase once spoken by Cyrus. Distance is not about where you go. It's about what falls away behind you. With each mile, something fell away. The pressure of form, the expectation of speed, the echo of applause that had never quite reached him. At noon he found a stone ledge beneath a sycamore and rested. He drank slowly, ate 2 figs, watched an ant crawl across his hand, tiny and fearless. He opened his journal, wrote 1 line. The road speaks with silence, and it says, "Walk with nothing, and you will carry everything." He sat a while longer, then continued. In the distance, a group of boys were herding goats. One of them waved a stick with theatrical flair. Another laughed so hard he dropped his satchel. Gaius smiled as he passed, nodded once, and kept walking. The land grew rockier, the road more narrow. He welcomed the change. It mirrored his thoughts, less polished, more real. He thought of his own feet, so often overlooked, yet carrying the entire weight of his learning. He noticed how his right foot favored the outer edge slightly, how his left toes curled just before landing. He adjusted his gait, listened. The road responded, not with answers, with rhythm, with steadiness, with truth. By late afternoon, the sky had turned a deeper blue, and a soft wind pushed from the west. Gaius reached a ridge where the path forked. One direction led toward the coast, the other back into the hills. He did not choose. He sat on a large, flat rock between them and simply watched. He watched the dust swirl in miniature dances. He watched the grass lean with the breeze. He watched the sun play its slow, inevitable game with the land, and he breathed. It occurred to him then that he did not need to go farther today, that sometimes distance was not forward, it was inward. He took out his journal once more and wrote, "I walked to see what I carried. The farther I went, the lighter I felt. The lighter I felt, the clearer I saw, and what I saw was simple. Movement is not about escape, it's about invitation." He closed the book, watched the sky for a while longer, then rose, turned around, and began to walk back toward Capua, not because he was finished, but because he had gathered what he came for. The return was quiet, the shadows grew longer, and the dust rose again with each step, greeting him like an old friend. The sparring ground was still, not quiet from absence, but from anticipation, the kind of stillness that gathers itself like breath before a long-held note, like air just before the storm speaks its first word. Gaius stood at one end of the practice, Ring, the sword in his hand, balanced but not yet alive. Across from him, another trainee, Varian, rolled his shoulders slowly, eyes calm, feet rooted in the sand. Neither moved. Titus stood between them for a moment longer, then stepped back, saying only, "Begin when ready." But no one rushed, because the lesson today was not about victory. It was about the moment just before movement, the silence before the shout. Gaius inhaled. He felt the weight of the sword, not heavy, but present. He noticed the way his right foot dug slightly deeper into the sand than the left. He counted the beat of his heart. 1, 2. Pause. He watched Varian's shoulders rise and fall with breath. He saw the way the wind curled a lock of hair near the man's brow. This was not a fight. It was a conversation waiting for its first word, and in that space, Gaius listened. He remembered how Titus once said, "The sword does not teach you how to win, it teaches you how to wait." And so he waited. He let his breath settle. He softened the grip on his blade, not weakly but honestly. He allowed himself to be here, fully, without rushing toward result. A drop of sweat traced his temple. Varian moved, just a half step. A weight shift, and Gaius mirrored it, not to react but to remain aligned. They circled slowly, dust rising around them, time thinned, and then, almost imperceptibly, the match began. No shout, no charge, only a simple strike, clean, testing. Gaius parried, not forcefully, just enough. They moved like reeds swaying, each motion a question, each response a breath, strike, block, step, circle, then pause. It was not battle, it was poetry. And yet, beneath that softness there was fire, a held flame, a respectful pressure. Neither sought to dominate, they sought to understand, to meet, to test not the edge of the blade, but the depth of their awareness. As the sparring continued, Gaius found his movements slower than usual, more deliberate. He was not chasing Varian, he was tracking him, not with eyes but with energy. He felt where the strike would land before it came. He knew where to move, not from strategy, but from listening. There were moments when their swords rang sharp, metal against wood, rhythm against rhythm. But those were not the focus. The focus was the space between the sounds, the silence, the breath before the clash, the awareness before the answer. After a time, Titus called a halt. They stepped back. Neither bowed. They simply breathed, acknowledging the journey they had just shared. There was no winner. There was no lesson to declare, only the echo of motion and the space that had cradled it. Gaius lowered his sword, walked to the side of the ring, sat on the warm stone wall that marked its edge. He watched as the dust settled back to earth. He felt his pulse slow, not from exhaustion, but from completeness. He opened his journal and wrote, "Today I did not fight, I waited. And in the waiting I found the thread that connects breath to blade, presence to power. The silence before the shout is where the true warrior lives." He looked up. The sun had passed its peak. The shadows had begun to lengthen. The world, it seemed, had shifted while they sparred, and yet it had not rushed. It had waited with them, had breathed with them, had held them in that sacred stillness that so often goes unnoticed. He closed the journal and watched Varian stretch his arms, then smile faintly in his direction. It was not a grin of triumph. It was recognition. They had both visited a place few reached, the space before noise, the breath before blade, the silence before the shout, and returned, quieter than before, but stronger, wiser, more whole. The mountains rose like folded parchment on the horizon, gentle yet firm, a quiet hymn of earth and time. It had been a long morning walk. Gaius left Capua at sunrise, following a narrow path that snaked upward through groves of chestnut and myrtle. His only company was birdsong, and the occasional rustle of lizards in dry leaves. He carried no sword, only a flask, a small satchel of bread, and his journal. By mid-morning, he reached the stream. It wasn't marked on maps, nor named in the stories. It flowed without ceremony, clear and low over a bed of smooth dark stones. The water was cold, almost sharp, and it danced without pause, curling around roots and rocks, babbling to itself in a voice older than the city. Gaius knelt at the edge, cupped his hands and drank. The taste was wild, clean, untouched. He sat on a flat rock, letting the sunlight dry the drips from his chin, and watched the stream move. And it was here, amidst that quiet, constant flow, that he saw the stone. Not large, not dramatic, just one among many. But somehow stiller, as if it wasn't just being passed by the water but guiding it. The stream rushed around it, left, right, over the top, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. But the stone never moved. It didn't resist. It didn't absorb. It simply stayed. Present, unshaken. Gaius found himself watching it more closely, the way water curved against it, then split, the way moss clung to its shaded edge, the way it seemed to know something he didn't. And he remembered a lesson from Titus. Strength isn't how hard you push. Sometimes it's how deeply you settle. The stone didn't push. It settled. It didn't challenge the stream. It allowed it, and in doing so it shaped it. That realization moved through Gaius like the stream itself, slow, refreshing, quiet in its certainty. He lay back on the grass, the stream's voice curling beside his ear like a lullaby in a forgotten tongue. His breath slowed. The sky above held soft clouds drifting like thoughts without weight. He thought of his training, of the days filled with noise, shouts, strikes, tension, and then of the days that whispered, walking roads, watching trees, waiting in silence. Those days had changed him more, like water around stone. Not with impact, but with constancy. He sat up again and removed his journal. Carefully he wrote, "Today I met the stone beneath the stream. It taught me how to stay, not with resistance, but with truth. The stream does not break the stone. It honors it. Because it knows. The unmoved heart is not cold, it is kind." He closed the book and rested it on his lap. He looked again at the stone, then removed his sandals and stepped into the stream. The cold shocked him at first, but he did not flinch. Walked slowly, feeling each stone beneath his feet, each step a new awareness. Some stones shifted underfoot. Others held firm. Each taught him something. When he reached the center of the stream, he found another stone, flat, broad, sun-warmed. He stood upon it, closed his eyes, and listened. The water flowed around his ankles, the wind moved across his shoulders, and something deep within him settled, not like sleep, like root, like bone. He stood there a long while, letting the world flow as it wished, not interfering, not escaping, only being. Eventually, the sun dipped low behind the ridge, and the shadows reached. Long across the clearing, Gaius stepped out of the stream, dried his feet with his tunic, and slid his journal back into his satchel. Before he left, he knelt beside the stream once more, pressed his hand gently to the teaching stone and whispered, "Thank you." Then, with slow, grounded steps, he followed the path downward, back toward the city, back toward the noise, but now with a stream inside him and a stone beneath. The stars that evening were especially soft, not bright, not sharp, just present, like distant candles lit for no reason other than to remind the sky it was still being watched. Gaius sat beneath the olive tree, arms resting on his knees, head tilted back. The day had passed without urgency. No training, no errands, just slow hours filled with quiet meals, careful observation, and walking without destination. He felt no fatigue, but he felt ready. Ready, not to end the day, but to release it. There was a difference. The city of Capua hummed low in the distance, market songs fading, laughter curling like smoke over rooftops. A child cried once, then was comforted. A door creaked, a jug was emptied. Then gradually the world exhaled and became still. Gaius stood slowly and made his way to his sleeping mat. It had been laid neatly, as always, with a woven blanket folded at the corner and his journal resting just beside the lamp. He did not write tonight. The words would come later. Tonight was not for expression, it was for dissolving. He blew out the lamp. The room faded into shapes, then shades, then only breath. He lay back, closed his eyes, and let go. There was no thought, not because he pushed them away, but because they chose not to come. No images stirred, no fragments of memory, no plans, no echoes, only the slow rhythm of breath entering and leaving. Inhale, Soft. Exhale. Softer. The mat cradled him, but he did not sink. The night did not cover him. It held him. Time passed, not in minutes, but in space. A vast, quiet space where nothing asked to be named, where nothing knocked. Where even the mind, that ever-chattering companion, chose silence. He did not dream, not of trees, not of battle, not of lessons. He did not float. He did not fall. He simply was. Resting, completely, without shape, without story. Like the dark between stars, like the pause between waves, like the moment just after a candle goes out but before the smoke curls. Hours passed, or perhaps none, and then, gently, quietly, his body stirred, not with alarm, not with resistance, with readiness. The first breath of morning entered him not through his nose, but through his skin. The air was cooler, faintly blue, the kind of blue that only arrives when the sun has not yet appeared, but the world remembers light. He opened his eyes. No dreams clung to him, no urgency pressed. He was rested, not because he had slept, but because he had released. He sat up. The room was still, the mat beneath him warm from his body. He looked at his hands. They felt new, as if nothing had been added, only removed. He reached for his journal and wrote slowly, softly. Last night I did not dream. I did not wander. I did not speak to the sky. I rested not in sleep but in being. I now know rest is not what happens when we close our eyes. It is what happens when we open to stillness and let it enter us. He closed the book, and for a long moment simply sat, breathing, listening. The day would begin soon, but he would carry this night with him, not like a memory, like a stone in his palm, smooth, weightless, honest. The bell rang at the usual hour. Its tone, soft and round, drifted through the air like the rim of a cup being touched by wind. The sound echoed across rooftops, down the side streets, and into the courtyard of the Ludus, where dew still clung. To the edges of training posts, Gaius opened his eyes, and did not rise immediately. There was no dread in him, no eagerness, either, only breath. He sat up, let his feet touch the cool floor, and took a slow moment to notice how light filtered through the curtain. There were no thoughts of victory, no imagined adversary waiting in the ring. Only the morning, waiting, without demand. He dressed, not in haste, not with ceremony, just a tunic belted simply, sandals with leather soft from use. He walked to the practice yard. The sand was smooth, recently raked, untouched by foot or blade. The scent of olives drifted in from the west, mixing with the faintest trace of ash from the forge. A few others were already training, grunts and footfalls, the occasional clap of wood against wood. But Gaius felt no need to join them. Not yet. He found a quiet corner, removed his sandals and stepped barefoot into the sand. He closed his eyes, raised his hands, and moved. But not as before, not to improve, not to defend, not even to express. He moved because it was morning, and because movement was simply what the body knew how to do. The forms came, gentle arcs, slow pivots, the stretch of one limb opening into space, the return of another, but none of them felt like fighting. They felt like remembering, like the wind remembering how to turn a leaf, like the sea remembering how to touch the shore. His heart did not race. His breath did not quicken, he did not sweat, he glided, he listened, and at one point, halfway through a familiar sword sequence, he paused mid-motion and realized he had forgotten to fight. There was no enemy in his thoughts, no imagined strike to block, no phantom wound to avoid, only air, only balance, only the shape of being. Smiled. Not because he had reached something, but because he had released something. When he finished, he bowed, not to an audience, not to a trainer, but to the space around him, to the silence, to the sand, to the self that had simply moved. Without struggle. Titus had been watching. He approached quietly, hands behind his back. "You did not fight," the old man said, nodding toward the space where Gaius had danced alone. Gaius looked down. "No," Titus smiled. "Good. It means you've started to learn what the sword cannot teach." Gaius tilted his head. "And what is that?" Titus looked to the horizon. "Peace. The kind that doesn't arrive with a shout. The kind that grows like moss, slowly, softly, without anyone noticing." He placed a hand on Gaius's shoulder, then walked away, leaving the words to settle. Gaius sat in the sand, cross-legged. He didn't reach for his journal right away. He just breathed, watched the others continue their drills, now loud again, now urgent, but he did not feel behind. He felt beside. When at last he opened his book, he wrote, "This morning I moved without purpose, and I found peace waiting there. I did not fight. I forgot to. And in that forgetting I remembered how to live." He closed the book, stood, brushed sand from his knees, and walked. Not back to training, but to the olive tree. To sit, to be, to watch the day unfold, not as a series of challenges, but as a stream of soft invitations. The sky was pale with morning light, not bright, not golden, just soft, like the inside of a seashell lit from within. Gaius stood in the center of the training yard, alone. No sword in hand, no shield on arm, only breath, only silence. It had been many seasons since he first stood on this sand, uncertain, eager, his body filled with questions he did not yet know how to ask. Back then his movements were sharp, his eyes hungry, his limbs stiff with effort. Now he moved differently, or rather, he didn't move at all. Not yet. He waited, listened. The world was quiet. No wind, no birdsong, even the fountain beyond the wall seemed to hold its voice. Titus sat nearby on a bench worn smooth by years. He said nothing, only watched. This was not a test, it was a return. Gaius closed his eyes and moved. One breath, one step, one slow curved gesture, the first movement of the first form he had ever learned. But now it was different. It was not practice, it was presence. Each motion unfolded like a leaf opening to sunlight, slow, intentional, free of resistance. He did not correct himself, he did not rush, he did not reach, he allowed. The form was no longer a sequence to complete. It was a place to dwell. He turned, stepped, shifted weight, raised arms, lowered gaze, and let the form become breath. Let breath become thought, let thought dissolve into movement. Titus said once, "The final form is not the hardest. It is the quietest. It is the one you do not perform. It is the one you become." Now Gaius understood. He moved not to demonstrate, but to remember, not to improve, but to return. Return to the center, to the circle, to the stone beneath the stream, to the hand that never struck, to the tree that did not speak, to the shadow that listened. He remembered each lesson, not as memory, but as rhythm, and the rhythm carried him, through each turn, each breath, each pause, until the form dissolved, and he stood once more at its end, not triumphant, but still. Titus rose, walked slowly to his side, and placed a hand on Gaius's shoulder. "You've done it." Gaius looked at him. The old man shook his head gently. "Not the form," he said. "You've learned how not to chase." Gaius smiled. a quiet smile, like the one the olive tree might give if it could. He bowed, not from habit, from gratitude, then left the ring, walked past the training posts, the stone wall, the rack of wooden swords now faded by sun. He stepped into the courtyard and felt no urgency, only presence. He sat beneath the olive tree, his old friend, his silent witness, and opened his journal for the last time. He wrote, "Today, I completed." The final form. It was not complex, it was not grand, it was simple, like water falling, like bread rising, like breath returning. I did not feel powerful. I felt still. And in that stillness I found the shape of peace, not to hold but to carry. He closed the book, set it beside him, and let the wind move his hair, let the sun warm his knees, let the world continue, unhurried. He was no longer becoming, he was being, not finished, not perfect, just ready, and quietly whole.